Good afternoon. In just a few weeks, the landscape of international relations has shifted as several European countries publicly condemn Israel's aggressions in Lebanon, marking a notable change in their stance. As cities lay in ruins and countless civilians suffer, these nations have voiced their objections to the aggression, raising questions about the future of Israel's support in Europe. Meanwhile, Israel's response has been firm, defending its actions against claims of excessive force by claiming self-defense against Hezbollah. But why has Israel specifically targeted UN forces in Lebanon, and what implications does this have for its international relations? Is this European criticism signaling the beginning of a withdrawal of support for Israel? Welcome to In Depth.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
As Israeli airstrikes intensify on Lebanon, several European countries have voiced strong objections, sharply criticizing Israel's military tactics and the devastating consequences for civilians and UN peacekeepers. Let us examine Europe's shifting stance on the conflict and explore the reasons behind their criticism and whether this marks a turning point in Europe's long-standing relations with Israel.
Since the onset of Israeli airstrikes on Lebanon, several European nations, including France, Germany, and the UK, have issued strong condemnations of Israel's military campaign. Their criticism stems from mounting civilian casualties, widespread infrastructure damage, and the alarming targeting of UN peacekeeping forces in the region. France, a longtime ally of Lebanon, spearheaded diplomatic efforts urging Israel to de-escalate the conflict and adhere to international law. Meanwhile, the UK and Germany voiced concerns over the growing humanitarian crisis, with Germany making a direct call for an immediate halt to hostilities. In defense of its action, Israel framed the airstrikes as necessary measures of self-defense, insisting that they were aimed at dismantling Hezbollah's military infrastructure. Israeli officials dismissed the European criticism as biased, emphasizing the existential threat posed by Hezbollah, a militant group. They accused of using southern Lebanon as a base for attacks Israeli territory. The situation became particularly fraught with the targeting of UNIFIL, United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, peacekeeping positions, heightening diplomatic tensions. Israel has maintained that Hezbollah strategically uses their positions as shields for their operations, while critics argue that Israel deliberately strikes UN forces to limit their ability to monitor military activities on the ground. The bombardment of these forces has only fueled international outcry. Although European nations continue to support a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is a growing discomfort over Israel's military tactics in Lebanon. The recent wave of criticism suggests a potential shift in diplomatic dynamics, as European leaders increasingly call for a more balanced approach to achieving peace in the Middle East. This evolution signals that while support for Israel remains intact, there may be a recalibration in how Europe engages with the conflict moving forward.
Now, the Guardian newspaper has reported that Britain, Italy, France and Germany have condemned Israeli attacks on the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, declaring them contrary to international humanitarian law. In a joint statement, the four nations emphasized the critical stabilizing role of UNIFIL in southern Lebanon and insisted on the need for Israel to ensure the safety of peacekeepers. Recent Israeli attacks have resulted in injuries to strong concern, urging all parties to respect the mission's safety. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu denied targeting peacekeepers intentionally, but reiterated calls for their withdrawal from combat zones, a request that the US UN peacekeeping chief rejected, affirming that UNIFIL would remain in place. Now, to discuss this further, Zaid Taim, an expert in international relations who's in Amsterdam, and Marcel Belougi, a military expert who is in Beirut. Welcome to both of you. We're going to start with you, Mr. Taim. Would you tell us more about these various European countries that are mentioned having objections to the recent Israeli bombings in Lebanon, and what does it mean?
Good evening. First of all, the systematic targeting that is deliberate and committed by the Israeli occupation army against UNIFIL in southern Lebanon, as well as the genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza, Jerusalem, and West Bank. They also asked to evacuate the locations of UNIFIL from south of Lebanon, which is unprecedented thing and means that the Zionist entity is violating the international legitimacy and the international humanitarian law and the different international laws, which is a crime. In addition to the flagrant violations that are very continuous against Resolution 1701, which undermines the mandate of UNIFIL. I think the occupation to prevent the renewal of UNIFIL mandates is using all the types of weapons to guarantee the lack of any accountability. UNIFIL is UN troops that came under the Resolution 1701 to maintain security between both parties. The occupation tries to commit war crimes without any accountability. This is the demand of the occupation. I think the European Union tried to practice pressure. Mr. Joseph Borrell talked about this indeed, and they refused to withdraw. The Secretary General of the United Nations yesterday, in a press conference, asked that these troops do not withdraw because this is unprecedented. It's a slap to the international law and the international humanitarian law. UNIFIL are international forces existing in the south of Lebanon under an international resolution. It's not possible to allow this occupation to commit further massacres against the civilians. These forces are here to make sure that everything is right. I think the European stance is very progressive in this regard.
Okay, and Mr. Belougi in Beirut, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has suggested that UNIFIL's presence between the two sides has slowed the Israeli advance. What are the occupation forces trying to achieve that the peacekeepers are stopping them from doing?
عندما يحدث بالجنوب مع القوات الدولية نتيجة تراكمات قديمة وانتهاكات لم تعالج بالماضي. منذ إنشائها ظل الحرب الإسرائيلي متواصل في الجنوب وكانت بالطبيعة.
Israelis are continuing their actions in the south, and it was natural that the resistance and Hezbollah will spread their armed existence due to the Israeli violations. These violations are very old and now they're developed. With the Israeli incursion in the south, UNIFIL implement Resolution 1701, which is an obstacle before the Israeli invasion, as they will witness the great destruction in the south, in the villages, cities, and in the residential areas. UNIFIL. They say that UNIFIL failed in the south, and fighting rules are contradicted, and that they haven't defended all the areas that was to be destroyed by the Israelis. They have to move from chapter 7 to chapter 6. to become a deterrent force between both forces, so they cannot practice the role of supervision. Hezbollah forces are doing the necessary immunity in the south. This is the Lebanese resistance defending the villages. They dig trenches, and which contradicts Resolution 1701. However, it's resulted and it's a reaction due to the slowness in the implementation of international resolution, either with the Israeli party or the Lebanese resistance. Hence, this operation should be immediately stopped, and UNIFIL troops should be taken to Chapter 7. The upcoming operations will be more hostile in the south, and it will be dangerous for UNIFIL troops. The spread of the non-defensive army and supervision forces will also pose a danger to the legitimate Lebanese forces and to UN forces. Israel now invades and tries to attack some hills to center and take central locations in order to control the military sectors, to protect its progression if they try to make any progress in the future. I think the resistance are dragging the enemy Israeli forces to winter. Both parties are fully ready to fight. The upcoming days will unfold developments that will endanger peacekeeping forces.
And back to you, Mr. Taim in Amsterdam. How has Israel responded to the criticism from these European countries? And what excuses or reasons are they using to justify their actions?
The European Union and Europe generally support the international law. They agree and completely insist on applying and implementing the international law, in particularly that there were important resolutions issued by the European Union and even by international courts, United Nations and the Security Council. Europe supports stability and using all their possibilities, either France or European Union, as said by Joseph Borrell, the representative of the European Union Foreign Affairs. All of them supported this fact. Many reports today say that this occupation, especially Benjamin Netanyahu, tried to create a new mechanism in the societies for new wars to guarantee his sustainability in leading his extreme government, which contradicts the international law. For example, when he used some internationally prohibited or banned weapons against the civilians. For this reason, the European Union always asks for ceasefire and the protection of the civilians and displaced people. Now, in Lebanon, the Europeans are trying to help the displaced people, and they provided the European kitchen to supply the people who are displaced from the south of Lebanon. Israel is still using the genocide in Gaza, and half of the villages on the borders are fully struck, and they are being erased from the map, which is against the international humanitarian law. It's noticeable that, for example, the uses of weapons and the use of explosive robots that act randomly and chaotically in order to explode among the citizens. So they are using the same way, even more harsh way in the south of Lebanon. I think that the European Union, since it signed conventions and agreements and is aware of the details of Resolution 1701 on UNIFIL troops, especially that the European Union led these negotiations. There was an agreement to define the borders. That all was to stop these Israeli forces from exceeding the borders. But when the occupation, Benjamin Netanyahu, demand with unprecedented terror to withdraw UNIFIL troops means the invasion of the borders of another country and contradicts and violates the international law and doesn't respect the international humanitarian law. I think everything being practiced by the Zionist gangs is a war crime and a genocide. It's a new one, similar to the one conducted in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu, with full honesty, in the light of the lack of the international community to stop the occupation and to stop the government of the occupation from committing further crimes, and with the support of the United States of America, I believe that many politicians are saying that not punishing the occupation for the war crimes encouraged them to commit more massacres against the civilians and the citizens in the villages and the cities of Lebanon and Palestine. I'd like also to mention an important point, which is that the European Union issued a resolution where they refused the withdrawal of UNIFIL. The United Nations and Antonio Guterres temporarily refused the withdrawal of UNIFIL. I don't think that this will please or satisfy the extreme right-wing government in Israel.
Okay, and coming back to you, Marcel Boulougi in Beirut. So we had the attacks on the UN peacekeeping forces in Lebanon, resulting in wounding 5 peacekeepers. But of course, we have 2,000 civilians killed over the past year, and more than 1 million displaced peoples. Why now? Some might say it's better late than never. Others would say it's about time that there was some criticism for Israel. What do you make of the fact that it took attacks on UN peacekeepers for countries to start calling it out?
Can you explain your question, because it needs to be repeated again?
Okay, yeah. What do you make of the situation that European countries have only started criticizing Israel once peacekeepers have been injured, rather than the 2,000 dead people in Lebanon over the past year?
I used to be a liaison officer with the UN troops when I was in my service in the state army. The violations are very old and they were not handled at the proper level. The troops in the south had a task which is reporting the violations, but these violations were not handled. As for the diplomatic level, Israel says that they have targeted UN troops when they do not mean it in an undeliberate way. But of course, this is not right. The losses are massive in the south, but the international forces and the big countries only moved when UNIFIL faced losses. It's clear that the enemy, Israeli forces, do not care about the international humanitarian law and do not care about the European forces. They act as if they have a single ally or a single friend, which is the United States of America, that supplies them with weapons and equipment, and they're not affected by the European power. If the United Nations troops remain in the south and Israel tried to invade, they will not care about UN locations, and they will not care about the casualties in souls and lives and in the establishments of UNIFIL. Israel will invade, and UN forces will never represent an obstacle based on the past experience and the history of dealing with the United Nations, which is something very disappointed for the Lebanese people. So Israel will not care, and they will attack the locations of the United Nations, and they will not pay any attention for future losses.
Okay, well, it's a fascinating discussion. Gentlemen, both, please do stay with me. We're going to just take a short break, but we will come back and discuss this further. We're just going to have a little break to look at the shifts in the Israeli-European relations between aid and criticisms. Now, we're going back to our discussion with our two guests. We have got Zeid Taim, who is in Amsterdam, and Marcel Belougi, who is in Beirut. We're going to come back to you, Mr. Belougi. The Security Council has called for the full implementation of Resolution 1701. The United States and France have said that strengthening Lebanon's army would be crucial to implementing the resolution. Where are we with that now, and what is the UN and international parties doing to help implement the resolution?
الجيش اللبناني
The Lebanese
مهمته في
army
جنوب
has a mandate in the south, which is the supervision points with the United Nations. And the defensive situation resolution was not implemented. It's only just control, supervision and support to UNIFIL troops. Because when there were fights with the Gaza front line, the parliament didn't meet to take a decision for war. So the decision of war was taken by the resistance to support Hamas. As for Resolution 1701, this resolution needs to be implemented strictly and accurately. 1701, in my opinion, will not be obeyed by Israel because of the danger posed by the missiles of Hezbollah. And this resolution will not protect the north of Israel, the target of Lebanon. So equipping and arming the Lebanese army is very important. But when it comes to the implementation of Resolution 1701 and the resolution of the Lebanese state and UN resolutions, the Lebanese army will be spread in the south and they can perform their functions completely, just like in Jordan and in Egypt. If it needs any missiles, it can be equipped later on with these missiles. As for Hezbollah, the implementation has to be, the implementation of 1701 should be done by withdrawing Hezbollah forces and disarming the missiles that affect the north of Israel, so it will not be a justification for the Israeli violation of UN resolutions and Israeli attacks. The Lebanese army definitely can be spread according to an internal Lebanese decision and in implementation of international resolutions. It can be spread.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining me on the program. Unfortunately, we have just run out of time. Zeid Taim is an expert in international relations, and Marcel Belougi, military expert. Thank you both for joining me on In Depth. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes on Q News.